Well, continuing on with the cavalcade of collection data structures, we're now going to look at queues. Queues maintain a list of items kind of like stacks do, but they're different than stacks in that they're FIFO, or first in, first out, kind of like a line of people waiting at a counter. In fact, if you've ever spent any time in the UK, you'll probably hear lines referred to as queues. And queues in programming work pretty much the same way. Something enters the queue and it's the first one in, it's also the first one out, and items move through the queue in an orderly fashion, or at least they should. Using queues in C# is similar to using stacks, only instead of being last in, first out, it's going to be first in, first out. To declare a queue, you use the queue class name, and here I've got a queue named myQueue, and I create a new queue. And then to put things on the queue, instead of using push and pop, we're going to use enqueue and dequeue. So in this case, I'm going to create my new myQueue variable. I'll call enqueue, and in this case, I'm passing in a string, but it's an object, so it could be anything. It could be a number or whatever. I'm passing in a string. When I do that, string 1 will be placed in the queue. If I then enqueue string 2, string 1 will move down, and then string 2 will now be at the back of the queue. Instead of using pop, I'm going to use dequeue. So when I say dequeue, the first item will come off of the queue like this. That leaves string 2 as the current first item. And just like using stacks, I can do things like peek, and peek is non-destructive. In other words, it doesn't actually take things off the queue. It just shows me what's at the front of the queue. In this case, it's now string 2. And also, like stacks, I can use the count property to see how many items are actually on the queue. So since they're so similar to stacks, let's just go ahead and waste no time and get over to the code so we can see this working in action. Okay, here we are in the code. One of the things I haven't pointed out up until now, which you probably have noticed, is that you need to include a namespace in order to use the collection classes. Up until now, we've had collections generic, which has been included for us by default. But in order to use things like stacks and queues and array lists, you need to include this guy right here using system.collections. This is the namespace you need to include in order to use the classes we've been talking about so far. So to use queues and stacks and array lists and so on, just make sure you have that included. Okay, so let's jump over to the snippets, and you can see I've scrolled down to the queue section, and I'm going to go ahead and copy these lines. And this is the setup code right here. And I'll just paste this in. So right there on line 13, creating a new queue, and then I'm enqueuing for items. And I'm going to write out how many items there are in the queue. And sure enough, there are 4 items, just like you would expect there to be. Now let's go back to the snippets. Just to show you that you can use other kinds of loop constructs with these collection classes, I'm going to use a while loop. And if you've been watching along with me so far, you've probably noticed that I've used for loops, I've used for each loops. It's time to give the while loop its turn. So here I'm going to say while myQueue.count is greater than 0. We're going to dequeue items. You can see they're on line 23. And then the following line 24, we're just going to say dequeuing object whatever and write it out to the console. Each time we dequeue something, the count property is going to automatically be decremented for us. We don't have to worry about taking care of that. The class keeps track of how many items there are in the queue. And since dequeue takes things off of the queue, the count will change for us. So we're going to go ahead and compile this and build it, make sure it works, and it did. And let's just go ahead and run this. You can see that we're dequeuing items in the same order that they were put onto the queue. So item 1 was the first one in, and it's the first one out, followed by items 2, 3, and 4. So queues are similar to stacks, only they operate more like a line. If you find yourself in need of a collection class where the order is important and you need to process things in the same order that they come in, use queues instead of stacks.